The courthouse library was quiet, save for the faint rustling of papers and the occasional creak of old wooden shelves. Karoline sat at a small table in the corner, surrounded by stacks of dusty law books and folders filled with notes. The room smelled of ink and aged paper, a scent that reminded her of late nights spent studying in college. But this wasn't school anymore. This was real life, and the stakes couldn't be higher. She opened one of the books, its pages yellowed with age, and began flipping through it methodically. Her mentor, Mr. William Hayes, had always told her that the answers were often hidden in plain sight, buried in cases long forgotten by everyone except those who bothered to look. Sometimes, he would say, the smallest detail can change everything. Those words echoed in her mind as she scanned the text, searching for anything that might help her case. Daniel's face kept flashing in her thoughts, his tired eyes, his nervous fidgeting. He trusted her, believed in her, even though she was just starting out. She couldn't let him down. Not now. Not when so much depended on her finding something, anything, to turn the tide in their favor. After what felt like hours, something caught her eye, a footnote in a decades-old case involving similar charges. It was about an employee accused of embezzlement, but the key difference was the timeline. In that case, the defendant had been able to prove they weren't physically present during the times when the alleged crimes occurred. If Karoline could establish Daniel's whereabouts during the critical dates mentioned in the indictment, maybe she could create reasonable doubt. Her heart raced as she jotted down notes. This could work. It had to work. She needed evidence to back up her theory, though, and fast. Pulling out her phone, she called Daniel, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed. "Hey, Karoline," Daniel answered, sounding cautious. "What's up?" "I need you to think carefully," she said, her voice urgent. "Do you remember where you were on the days listed in the indictment? Specifically, the dates they claim you accessed the company's financial system?" There was a pause on the other end. Yeah, I think so," Daniel replied slowly. "Let me check my calendar. Hold on." Karoline tapped her pen against the table, waiting anxiously. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, Daniel came back on the line. "Okay, I've got it," he said. "On 2 of those days, I was working on a car repair job for Susan Meyer. You know, the woman who runs the bakery downtown. She brought her car in because it wouldn't start, and I spent most of the day fixing it." Susan Meyer. Karoline's pulse quickened. Susan was well known in the community, respected and trustworthy. If she could confirm Daniel's alibi, it could make all the difference. "That's perfect," Karoline said, trying to keep her excitement contained. "I'll reach out to her right away. Thanks, Daniel." Hanging up, she immediately dialed Susan's number. After a brief introduction and explanation, Susan agreed to meet her at the courthouse before the session resumed. Relief washed over Karoline, but she knew this was only the beginning. She still had to piece everything together and present it in a way that would convince Judge Bennett, and that wasn't going to be easy. Back in the courtroom, Richard Monroe was already seated, chatting casually with his team. He looked completely at ease, as if he'd already won. When Karoline returned to her seat, he shot her a smug grin, clearly expecting her to crumble under the pressure. She ignored him, focusing instead on organizing her notes and preparing for what lay ahead. When Susan arrived, Karoline greeted her warmly, thanking her for coming on such short notice. Susan, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, nodded reassuringly. "Anything to help Daniel?" she said. "He's a good guy, and I know he wouldn't do something like this." As the court reconvened, Judge Bennett wasted no time getting back to business. "All right, let's continue," he said, his tone brisk. "Mr. Monroe, call your next witness." Richard stood confidently, gesturing toward Gregory Cole, a former colleague of Daniel's who had been called to testify. Gregory took the stand, looking nervous but determined. He adjusted his tie and glanced at Richard, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Mr. Cole," Richard began, pacing slowly in front of the jury, "can you tell us what you witnessed regarding Mr. Foster's activities at the dealership?" Gregory cleared his throat. Well, I noticed some unusual behavior from Daniel around the time the money went missing. He seemed distracted, like he was hiding something, and I saw him using the computer in the office late one night when no one else was around. Karoline listened intently, taking mental notes. There was something off about Gregory's testimony. It felt rehearsed, too polished. She decided to test it during cross-examination. "Your Honor," she said, rising from her seat. "May I approach the witness?" Judge Bennett waved a hand dismissively. "Go ahead, Ms. Leavitt." Karoline stepped forward, her expression calm despite the storm brewing inside her. "Mr. Cole," she began, her voice steady, "you mentioned seeing my client using the computer late at night. Can you recall the exact date and time this occurred?" Gregory hesitated, his brow furrowing. I'm not sure about the exact time, but it was definitely after hours." "And how can you be certain it was my client?" Karoline pressed. "Did you see his face clearly? Could it have been someone else?" "Well, I assumed it was him," Gregory stammered. "He usually works late sometimes, so you didn't actually confirm it was Daniel?" Karoline interrupted, her tone sharpening slightly. "You're basing your entire testimony on an assumption?" Gregory squirmed in his seat, glancing nervously at Richard. "I guess so," the gallery murmured, sensing the crack in Gregory's story. Karoline pressed further, asking detailed questions about the layout of the office, the lighting conditions, and whether anyone else could have accessed the computer during that time frame. With each question, Gregory grew more flustered, his answers becoming increasingly inconsistent. When she finally returned to her seat, Karoline allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She had planted seeds of doubt, and now it was time to nurture them. Later, as the prosecution rested its case, Karoline prepared to present her rebuttal. She called Susan Meyer to the stand, introducing her as a character witness. Susan recounted how Daniel had spent hours repairing her car on one of the critical dates, providing a clear alibi. Her testimony was straightforward and credible, leaving little room for argument. Judge Bennett watched intently, his earlier skepticism giving way to curiosity. Even Richard seemed uneasy, shifting in his seat as Karoline wrapped up her presentation. For the first time since the trial began, Karoline felt a flicker of hope, not just for herself, but for Daniel, who deserved justice more than anyone realized. As the day drew to a close, Karoline packed up her belongings, exhausted but determined. She knew there was still a long road ahead, but for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. Against all odds, she had found a way to fight back, and she wasn't done yet. The next morning, the courtroom felt different. The air was heavier, charged with anticipation, as if everyone could sense that something significant was about to happen. Karoline arrived early, clutching her notes and a folder filled with documents. She had spent most of the night reviewing every detail, double-checking her arguments and rehearsing what she planned to say. Her hands trembled slightly as she set up her materials at the table, but her mind was sharp, focused, and ready. Daniel sat beside her, his expression a mix of hope and anxiety. He leaned over and whispered, "You've got this, Karoline. I trust you." His words were simple, but they carried weight. They reminded her why she was here, not just to win a case, but to stand up for someone who deserved a fair chance. She nodded silently, grateful for his faith in her. Across the aisle, Richard Monroe looked unusually restless. He shuffled through his papers, glancing occasionally at the jury with a furrowed brow. For the first time, he seemed uncertain, as if he sensed the tide might be turning. Still, he maintained his confident demeanor, refusing to show any cracks in his armor. When Judge Bennett entered the room, the chatter died down instantly. He took his seat, adjusting his glasses before addressing the court. "All right," he said gruffly. "Let's proceed. Ms. Leavitt, it's your turn." Karoline stood slowly, taking a deep breath to steady herself. She glanced at the jury, then at Judge Bennett before beginning. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecution has tried to paint my client, Mr. Daniel Foster, as guilty based on assumptions and circumstantial evidence. But let me remind you, assumptions are not proof, and suspicion is not guilt. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. They have failed to provide any concrete evidence tying Mr. Foster directly to the alleged embezzlement. Instead, they rely on vague testimonies and questionable timelines. We will demonstrate today that these accusations are unfounded and that my client has a credible alibi for the dates in question. She paused, letting her words sink in. Then, with deliberate calmness, she called Susan Meyer back to the stand. Susan approached confidently, her presence commanding respect. As she settled into the witness chair, Karoline began her questioning. "Ms. Meyer," Karoline said, her tone warm but professional, "can you please tell the court about the work my client performed for you?" Susan nodded. "Of course, about 2 months ago my car broke down and I brought it to Daniel's shop. He spent nearly an entire day fixing it, from early morning until late afternoon. I stayed nearby because I needed to pick it up as soon as possible." "And can you confirm the specific date this occurred?" Karoline asked. "Yes," Susan replied without hesitation. "It was on April 15th. I remember clearly because it was the same day I hosted a bake sale for the community center. After Daniel finished repairing my car, I drove straight to the event." Karoline turned to face the jury. "April 15th happens to be one of the key dates mentioned in the indictment against my client. According to the prosecution, Mr. Foster allegedly accessed the company's financial system on that day. Yet, as Ms. Meyer has testified, he was occupied elsewhere, working tirelessly to repair her vehicle." The jurors exchanged glances, some nodding thoughtfully. Karoline pressed on. "Ms. Meyer, did you interact with Mr. Foster throughout the day? Did you observe him leaving or being absent for extended periods?" "No," Susan answered firmly. "He was there the whole time, focused on the job. There's no way he could have been anywhere else." Richard leaned forward in his seat, clearly agitated. When it was his turn to cross-examine Susan, he tried to poke holes in her testimony. "Ms. Meyer," he said, his tone polite but probing, "how certain are you about the exact timing of events that day? People often misremember details, especially when recalling past events." Susan didn't flinch. "I'm very certain," she replied calmly. "As I mentioned earlier, it was a busy day for me. I had responsibilities at the bake sale, so I kept track of the time closely. Daniel completed the repairs around 3 o'clock, and I left shortly after to attend the event." Richard frowned, realizing he wasn't going to shake her confidence. He thanked her curtly and returned to his seat, visibly frustrated. Karoline seized the opportunity. Turning to Judge Bennett, she said, "Your Honor, we also have additional documentation supporting Mr. Foster's whereabouts on other critical dates. These include receipts, surveillance footage from the repair shop, and statements from co-workers who can vouch for his presence during those times." She handed copies of the evidence to the bailiff, who distributed them to the judge and jury. Each document reinforced her argument, creating a timeline that directly contradicted the prosecution's claims. The gallery murmured quietly, sensing the momentum shifting. Judge Bennett studied the materials carefully, his expression unreadably neutral. Finally, he looked up. "Mr. Monroe, do you have anything further to add?" Richard rose hesitantly. His usual swagger diminished. "Your Honor, while the defense has presented alternative explanations, none of this disproves the possibility that Mr. Foster committed the alleged acts outside the specified time frame." Karoline stepped forward immediately. "With all due respect, Your Honor, the burden of proof lies with the prosecution. It is their responsibility to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that my client is guilty. So far, they have offered nothing but speculation and unreliable testimonies." The courtroom fell silent. Everyone waited, holding their breath as Judge Bennett considered her words. For a moment it seemed like he might dismiss her argument outright, but then something unexpected happened. He nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. "Point taken," he said gruffly. "Proceed, Ms. Leavitt." Encouraged by this small victory, Karoline launched into her closing remarks. She spoke passionately, emphasizing the lack of direct evidence and the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she concluded, "justice demands certainty. It requires more than guesses and assumptions. Without irrefutable proof, convicting my client would be unjust and unfair." When she finished speaking, the room remained still, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Even Richard seemed subdued, his earlier bravado replaced by quiet unease. Karoline returned to her seat, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. As the session ended and the jury prepared to deliberate, Karoline allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. She knew the fight wasn't over yet, but she had done everything she could. Against overwhelming odds, she had stood her ground, challenged the prosecution, and fought for the truth. Daniel reached over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you," he said softly. "Whatever happens, I couldn't have asked for a better lawyer." Karoline smiled faintly, exhaustion mingling with pride. She had walked into this courtroom unsure of herself, mocked by the judge and underestimated by the opposition. But now, as she packed up her things and prepared to wait for the verdict, she felt a quiet strength within her, a belief that sometimes even the smallest voices could make the biggest impact. Outside, the sun shone brightly, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. Karoline stepped out briefly, taking a deep breath of fresh air. Whatever the outcome, she knew she had earned the respect of those who mattered most, not just Daniel, but herself. And that, in its own way, was a triumph worth celebrating. The courtroom was alive with murmurs, a low hum of anticipation filling the space like an invisible cloud. People shifted in their seats, some leaning forward eagerly, others glancing at their watches as if wondering how long this would take. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting golden streaks across the wooden benches and polished floor. The air smelled faintly of old paper and leather-bound books, a scent that seemed to carry the weight of countless trials before this one. At the center of it all stood Karoline Leavitt, her hands clasped tightly around a stack of papers. She looked young, too young, some might say, for someone standing in front of such a daunting figure as Judge Harold Bennett. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, and her suit, though professional, hung slightly loose on her frame, as if she hadn't yet grown fully into its authority. Beside her sat Daniel Foster, a man in his early 30s with calloused hands and weary eyes. He fidgeted nervously, tugging at the collar of his shirt, clearly uncomfortable in the formal setting. Across the aisle, Richard Monroe exuded confidence. His expensive suit fit him perfectly, tailored to accentuate his broad shoulders. His tie was a deep navy blue, matching the smug expression on his face. Richard had spent years building his reputation as a ruthless corporate attorney, someone who didn't just win cases but demolished opponents. Today he seemed almost bored, flipping casually through documents while occasionally shooting condescending glances toward Karoline. Judge Harold Bennett entered the room with a heavy gait, his black robe billowing behind him. He was a large man, both in stature and presence, and his stern demeanor commanded immediate attention. As he settled into his chair, adjusting his glasses, he scanned the room with sharp, calculating eyes. When his gaze landed on Karoline, there was a flicker of amusement quickly masked by professionalism. Still, anyone watching closely could see it. The subtle curve of his lips, the slight raise of an eyebrow. "All right," Judge Bennett said, his voice booming through the chamber. "Let's get started. Ms. Leavitt, you may begin your opening statement." Karoline took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This was her first major case, and she knew the stakes were high. Her client, Daniel, had been accused of embezzling thousands of dollars from his employer, a local car dealership. If convicted, he faced not only prison time, but also the loss of everything he'd worked for. Karoline had spent sleepless nights, preparing, poring over every detail of the case, determined to give Daniel the best defense possible. She stepped forward, clutching her notes tighter. "Your Honor," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "my client, Mr. Daniel Foster, is innocent of these charges. There is no concrete evidence linking him to the alleged crime, and we intend to demonstrate that the prosecution's claims are based on speculation rather than fact." Before she could continue, Judge Bennett interrupted. "Ms. Leavitt," he said, leaning back in his chair, "are you sure you're ready for this? This isn't exactly your typical traffic ticket case." The comment drew laughter from the gallery, soft chuckles rippling through the crowd. Karoline felt her cheeks flush, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact with the judge. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied firmly, though her voice wavered. "I am prepared to present a strong defense on behalf of my client." "Richard," Monroe smirked, clearly enjoying the moment. He leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, watching as Karoline struggled to regain her composure. To him, this was already a foregone conclusion. A rookie lawyer like Karoline didn't stand a chance against his experience and resources. He exchanged a knowing glance with one of his assistants, who nodded approvingly. Despite the mockery, Karoline pressed on. "The prosecution has failed to provide any direct evidence showing that Mr. Foster accessed the company's financial system during the alleged time frame. Furthermore, we will show that my client has a credible alibi for the dates in question." Judge Bennett raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "We'll see about that," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for everyone to hear. More snickers erupted from the audience, and Karoline clenched her jaw, fighting the urge to retreat. Instead, she focused on the task at hand, reminding herself why she was here. As she returned to her seat, Daniel leaned over and whispered, "You're doing great, Karoline. Don't let them get to you." His words were meant to encourage her, but they only highlighted the pressure she was under. Great wasn't good enough, not in this room. She needed to be extraordinary. Richard rose to deliver his opening statement, his movements smooth and deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, addressing the jury with practiced charm, "the facts of this case are clear. Mr. Foster abused his position of trust, using his access to the company's financial records to siphon off funds for personal gain. We have witnesses who will testify to his suspicious behavior, as well as documentation proving irregularities in the accounts during his tenure." He paused for effect, letting his words sink in. "This isn't about speculation, Your Honor, it's about accountability. And today, we will hold Mr. Foster accountable for his actions." The gallery murmured in agreement, some nodding along with Richard's arguments. Karoline watched silently, her mind racing. She knew Richard was good, better than most, but she refused to believe he was invincible. Somewhere in the mountain of evidence and testimony, there had to be a crack, a weakness she could exploit. All she needed was time to find it. When Richard finished speaking, Judge Bennett glanced at the clock. "All right, let's take a short recess," he announced. "We'll reconvene in 15 minutes. As the court emptied, Karoline lingered at her table, flipping through her notes. She felt the weight of the judge's skepticism pressing down on her, the laughter of the crowd still echoing in her ears. But beneath the doubt and fear, something else stirred, a spark of determination. She had come too far to give up now. Whatever it took, she would fight for Daniel, even if it meant facing the ridicule of the entire courtroom. Outside, Daniel approached her cautiously. "Hey, don't worry about what they think," he said softly. "You've got this. I believe in you." Karoline managed a small smile, grateful for his support. "Thanks, Daniel. I won't let you down." But as she gathered her things and headed toward the courthouse library, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a battle where the odds were stacked heavily against her. Yet, somewhere deep inside, she held on to hope that maybe, just maybe, she could turn the tide. The jury deliberation room was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of papers and the soft hum of whispered conversations. The 12 men and women sat around a long wooden table, their faces reflecting a mix of concentration and uncertainty. Some scribbled notes furiously, while others stared blankly at the evidence spread out before them. The weight of the decision rested heavily on their shoulders, and they knew it. Karoline waited outside the courtroom with Daniel, pacing back and forth as she tried to calm her nerves. She had done everything she could, presented her case, challenged the prosecution's arguments, and provided credible evidence to support Daniel's innocence. But now all they could do was wait, and waiting was the hardest part. Daniel watched her pace, his own anxiety mirrored in her restless movements. You should sit down, he said gently. You've earned a break. Karoline shook her head, her jaw tight. I can't. Not yet. Not until we know. Across the hall, Richard Monroe stood with his team, their expressions tense. They spoke in hushed tones, occasionally glancing toward Karoline and Daniel. For the first time, Richard looked unsure of himself. He had entered this trial confident that victory was inevitable, but now doubt lingered in his eyes. The jury's silence was unnerving, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted during Karoline's closing arguments. Hours passed, though it felt like days. The courthouse grew quieter as people began to leave, their curiosity giving way to impatience. Finally, a court officer appeared in the doorway. The jury has reached a verdict, he announced. The words sent a jolt through everyone in the room. Karoline stopped pacing, her breath catching in her throat. Daniel straightened up, gripping the edge of his chair tightly. Even Richard seemed to stiffen, his usual arrogance replaced by cautious anticipation. Back inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Judge Bennett took his seat, his expression unreadable as always. The jury filed in one by one, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. When they were settled, the foreman, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a serious demeanor, stood and handed the verdict slip to the bailiff. Judge Bennett unfolded the paper slowly, scanning its contents, before looking up. Has the jury reached a unanimous decision? He asked. Yes, Your Honor, the foreman replied, his voice steady. And what is your verdict? The foreman cleared his throat, pausing just long enough to make everyone hold their breath. We find the defendant, Mr. Daniel Foster, not guilty. The words hit like a thunderclap. The gallery erupted into murmurs, some people nodding approvingly, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Daniel let out a shaky breath, tears welling up in his eyes. He turned to Karoline, who stood frozen, her face pale with shock. Slowly, a smile spread across her lips and she exhaled deeply, the tension finally leaving her body. Richard Monroe clenched his fists, visibly struggling to maintain his composure. He muttered something under his breath to his assistant, though it was impossible to hear over the noise in the room. Judge Bennett banged his gavel sharply, calling for order. Quiet, he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. When the room fell silent, he addressed the jury. Thank you for your service. Court is adjourned. As the judge exited, the courtroom buzzed with activity. Reporters rushed forward, eager to get statements from both sides. Daniel hugged Karoline tightly, his gratitude overwhelming. You did it, he said, his voice choked with emotion. You saved me. Karoline managed a weak laugh, still processing what had just happened. We did it together, she replied softly. This was never just about me. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Judge Bennett approached Karoline. His earlier skepticism had softened, replaced by a look of grudging respect. Ms. Leavitt, he said gruffly, you proved me wrong today. Don't let anyone tell you you're not cut out for this line of work. Karoline blinked, surprised by his words. Thank you, Your Honor, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. That means a lot. Even Richard offered a reluctant nod as he passed by, acknowledging her skill if not her victory. It wasn't much, but it was enough to signal that Karoline had earned his respect, or at least his acknowledgement. Outside the courthouse, the sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the steps. Daniel lingered beside Karoline, hesitant to leave. I don't know how I'll ever repay you, he admitted. You changed my life. Karoline smiled, though it was tinged with exhaustion. Just keep doing what you're doing, she said. Help people, be honest. That's all the thanks I need. As Daniel walked away, Karoline stayed behind, taking a moment to reflect. She thought about the long hours, the sleepless nights, and the countless times she'd doubted herself. But more than anything, she thought about the lesson she'd learned, that persistence and preparation could overcome even the toughest challenges. Mr. William Hayes, her mentor, appeared at the bottom of the steps, smiling proudly. I heard the news, he said. Congratulations, Karoline. You handled yourself beautifully. Thanks to you, she replied, hugging him warmly. I couldn't have done it without your guidance. He chuckled, patting her shoulder. Nonsense, you found your footing all on your own. I just gave you a little push. As they stood there, watching the last rays of sunlight fade into twilight, Karoline felt a sense of peace wash over her. This case had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated, but it had also shown her what she was capable of. She realized that being a lawyer wasn't just about winning. It was about fighting for justice, standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, and refusing to give up, no matter how difficult the odds. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and there would undoubtedly be more challenges waiting for her. But for now, she allowed herself to savor this moment, knowing that she had made a difference, not just for Daniel, but for herself. And that, she realized, was the true reward. The days following the trial passed quickly for Karoline, though they were far from ordinary. News of her unexpected victory spread through the small town like wildfire. People who had once dismissed her as just another inexperienced lawyer now stopped her on the street to congratulate her. Some even brought her cases, small ones at first, but enough to keep her busy. It was a strange feeling, going from being underestimated to suddenly respected, almost overnight. Karoline tried to stay grounded despite the attention. She spent her mornings catching up on paperwork and meeting with new clients in her modest office. Her desk was cluttered with files, coffee cups, and sticky notes reminding her of deadlines. The space wasn't fancy. It had peeling paint and an old wooden chair that creaked whenever she leaned back, but it felt like home. For the first time, she began to see herself not just as someone trying to make it in the legal world, but as someone who truly belonged there. Daniel visited her one afternoon, carrying a box wrapped in brown paper. I wanted to thank you again, he said, setting the box on her desk. This isn't much, but I hope you like it. Karoline unwrapped it carefully, revealing a handmade clock crafted from polished wood. Engraved on its face was a simple message: for justice. She looked up at Daniel, touched by the gesture. It's beautiful, she said softly. Thank you. It reminded me of you, Daniel admitted. You're strong, dependable, and always working hard behind the scenes, just like this clock. Karoline smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. That means a lot coming from you. As Daniel left, Karoline placed the clock on her desk, where it ticked steadily, marking each passing second. It became a reminder of why she had chosen this path, to fight for fairness even when the odds seemed impossible. Later that week, Karoline received an invitation to speak at a local community center about her experience in the trial. At first, she hesitated. Public speaking wasn't her strong suit, and she worried about saying the wrong thing. But Mr. William Hayes encouraged her. People need to hear your story, he said. Not because you won, but because you showed them what determination looks like. So, on a chilly evening, Karoline stood before a small crowd gathered in the community center's auditorium. Families, students, and curious neighbors filled the seats, their eyes fixed on her expectantly. She took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium to steady herself. When I started practicing law, she began, her voice soft but clear, I thought success meant winning every case. I thought it meant never making mistakes or facing setbacks, but I was wrong. She paused, glancing at the faces in front of her. Success isn't about perfection. It's about learning from failure, standing up after you fall and refusing to give up, even when everyone tells you it's hopeless. She went on to share details of the trial, explaining how she had doubted herself and how others had doubted her too. There were moments when I wanted to quit, she admitted. But I remembered something my mentor once told me. Sometimes, the smallest detail can change everything. Those words kept me going. They reminded me to look deeper, to question assumptions, and to believe in the truth, even when no one else did. The audience listened intently, nodding along as she spoke. When she finished, applause erupted, filling the room with warmth. Several people approached her afterward, thanking her for sharing her story. One young woman, barely out of high school, shyly asked if Karoline had any advice for someone considering a career in law. "Be patient with yourself," Karoline replied kindly, "and never stop asking questions. The answers are out there. You just have to find them." As weeks turned into months, Karoline noticed subtle changes in herself. She walked taller, spoke more confidently, and approached challenges with a quiet determination. The courtroom no longer intimidated her. Instead, it felt like a place where she could make a difference. She still faced tough cases, some of which ended in defeat. But she learned to view those losses as opportunities to grow rather than failures to regret. Her relationship with Judge Bennett evolved as well. Though he remained stern during proceedings, he occasionally offered her words of encouragement outside the courtroom. "You're getting better," he remarked one day after a particularly difficult hearing. "Keep pushing yourself." Even Richard Monroe crossed paths with her again, though their interactions were less adversarial now. During a deposition, he complimented her preparation, admitting, "You've come a long way since that first trial." It wasn't exactly praise, but it was close enough to make her smile. One rainy afternoon, Karoline found herself back at the courthouse library, surrounded by stacks of books and papers. This time, however, she wasn't alone. A young intern from a nearby law school sat across from her, eager to learn. "Do you ever feel overwhelmed?" the intern asked hesitantly. "All the time," Karoline admitted with a laugh. "But that's part of the job. What matters is how you handle it." She shared tips and strategies, drawing from her own experiences. As the hours passed, she realized how far she'd come. Once a nervous rookie struggling to prove herself, she was now mentoring someone else, passing on the lessons she'd learned along the way. That evening, as she walked home under the glow of streetlights, Karoline reflected on her journey. She thought about the laughter she had endured, the doubts she had faced, and the victories she had fought for. Each step, no matter how small, had shaped her into the person she was today. Reaching her apartment, she paused to glance at the clock Daniel had given her. Its steady ticking echoed in the quiet room, a comforting reminder of her purpose. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She would continue fighting for justice, one case at a time, and maybe, just maybe, she would inspire others to do the same.